Picture Siberia. Not the Siberia of today, colder, stranger, and about to become the most dangerous place in the history of life on Earth. 252 million years ago, the ground here doesn't just crack, it opens. For nearly 1 million years, magma pours out of fissures across an area larger than the continental United States. 6 million square kilometers of basalt, thick enough in places to bury a mountain range. You are not watching a volcano, you're watching a wound in the planet that will not close. And on the other side of that wound, something almost impossible happens. Life very nearly ends. Not a lot of species die, nearly everything dies. By some estimates, as much as 90% or more of species on Earth, gone. The ocean turns into something closer to a chemistry experiment than a home. And what comes after isn't a quick bounce back, it's a wasteland. For a stretch of time, some scientists put as long as 10 million years. Complex ecosystems on this planet barely function. 10 million years. Say that number slowly. 10 million years is longer than the entire span of time between you and the earliest members of the human family tree, several times over. It's long enough that if this happened today, no early human, no dinosaur, nothing remotely resembling the animals you know would exist by the time it was over. And yet it happened here, on this planet, to the ancestors of nearly everything alive today, including several 100 million years of branching and chance later, you. Here's the part that should unsettle you most. This isn't ancient trivia. This is the closest life on Earth has ever come to total failure. Not the asteroid that got the dinosaurs. That one, life shrugged off in a few million years, relatively speaking. This one very nearly finished the story before it could keep going. And for a long time, scientists didn't even agree on how fast it happened, or why the world stayed broken for so long afterward. That mystery is what pulled me in. The book that sent me down this rabbit hole, and yes, I mean rabbit hole, though by the end you'll wonder if rabbit hole is too gentle a word for a 10 million year dead zone, is called The Ends of the World, by a science journalist named Brannen. He spent years talking to the geologists who've actually held the rock in their hands, the rock that recorded the day. Geologically speaking, the world nearly ended. I want to be upfront. Not everything in that book is settled science. Some of what excited paleontologists in the last 20 years is now being quietly walked back, or fought over in journals most of us will never read. I'll tell you where the ground is solid and where it's still shifting, because the honest version of this story is stranger than the tidy one. First, you need to understand what this planet actually looked like right before it happened, because the wrongness of what came next only makes sense once you see what was lost. 252 million years ago, Earth is in the late Permian period. There are no flowers yet, no birds, no mammals as you'd recognize them, just their distant, reptile-like ancestors, some of them strange, sail-backed creatures that looked like nothing alive today. The oceans are full of trilobites, ancient armored sea creatures that had been around, in one form or another, for nearly 300 million years by this point, older than the dinosaurs would ever get to be, older than trees had existed when trilobites first crawled the seafloor. There are horn corals building reefs. There are ancient relatives of squid drifting through Permian seas that had never seen a shark as we'd recognize one, never seen a fish that looked remotely modern. This world had survived a lot already. It had weathered ice ages. It had weathered its own share of die-offs. Life on Earth by this point had a track record of resilience. If you'd asked a geologist in the early 20th century whether anything could come close to ending it, they might have pointed to the asteroid everyone already knew about, the one that, tens of millions of years later, would finish off the dinosaurs. That's the extinction people know. That's the one with the movie-ready story. A rock from space, a crater, a single terrible day. This one doesn't have that story. There was no asteroid, or at least no confirmed one that did the damage. The killer here was the planet itself, turning against nearly everything living on it, from the inside. So let's go to where the evidence actually lives, not in a textbook summary, but in rock, layer by layer, the way scientists actually had to read it. Picture a geologist standing in a cliff face at a place in China called Maishan, where the boundary between the Permian and the following period is exposed like the layers of a cake sliced open. This isn't a metaphor for scientists, it's literally how they work. You walk along an exposed rock face, and each band of rock is a page of Earth's autobiography, laid down one thin layer at a time over millions of years. Somewhere in that cliff is the line. Below it, a world teeming with the strange, ancient variety of the late Permian. Above it, almost nothing. A kill zone, barren of nearly all the fossil types you'd find just below. For decades, that transition, Permian to Triassic, was known to be bad. Really bad. But how bad, and especially how fast, was murkier than you'd think. Rock doesn't come with a clock printed on it. You have to find one hidden inside it. That's where two researchers, Sam Bowring and Seth Burgess, working out of MIT, come in. They didn't set out to write a horror story about time. They set out to solve a technical puzzle. How do you pin down, with real precision, how long an extinction that happened 250 million years ago actually took? Here's the trick, and it's worth walking through because it's one of the most elegant tools in all of geology. Buried in some of the ash layers from this period are tiny crystals called zircons. Zircons are stubborn little things. They form when volcanic ash cools, and they lock a small amount of uranium into their structure as they crystallize. And uranium does something wonderfully useful for a geologist. It decays into lead at a rate that is essentially constant, like a clock that never needs winding, ticking away for billions of years. Measure the ratio of uranium to lead trapped in a zircon crystal, and you're not estimating an age. You're reading it, atom by atom, off a natural stopwatch that started the moment that ash cooled. Burgess and Bowring hunted down these zircon crystals in the ash layers bracketing the extinction, one layer from before the die-off accelerated, one from after, and measured the isotopes with extraordinary precision. And when they published their results in 2014, the number that came out stunned people who had spent careers studying this event. The main pulse of dying, the true collapse, where the overwhelming majority of the loss happens, took around 60,000 years. Give or take, with an uncertainty of about 48,000 years either way, so the true window could be shorter or a bit longer. But even at the outer edge of that uncertainty, we are talking about a geological eye blink, 250 million years of Earth's history, and the actual killing happens in a sliver of time so short that on the scale of a whole Permian period lasting tens of millions of years, it barely registers as a line's width. Let that sink in. 60,000 years sounds long to you and me. It is not long. It is shorter than the time modern humans have existed as a species. It's a blink, a stutter, a single bad afternoon by the standards of deep time. And in that blink, the majority of everything alive on Earth, animals that had persisted for hundreds of millions of years, entire families of trilobites, entire reef ecosystems, simply stopped. Why? What could kill that fast, that completely, without a rock falling from space? The Siberian traps. Remember that wound I described at the start, the 6 million square kilometers of erupting basalt? Here's the piece that took decades of careful dating to nail down. It wasn't a slow leak. Around 90% of all that magma erupted in about 1 million years, and the worst of the dying, that 60,000-year pulse, sits right inside that eruptive window. This is not a coincidence anyone takes seriously anymore. The Siberian traps are the trigger, not an asteroid. A planet erupting itself into crisis. Try to picture the scale of it, because 6 million square kilometers doesn't mean anything until you give it a shape. That's an area you could lay over most of a continent, layer upon layer of basalt, some sections estimated to be kilometers thick, stacked up like pages in a book nobody wanted to finish. And this wasn't one clean eruption, like a single volcano you could point a camera at. It was more like the crust of the Earth developing a chronic, spreading infection, fissure after fissure, opening, flooding the landscape again and again for the better part of 1 million years, with the worst of it concentrated even more tightly than that. Now think about what pouring that much molten rock through the crust actually does to the air above it. Because this is where the story stops being about lava and starts being about something that could reach every living thing on the planet at once, including the ones that never saw a single drop of magma. When magma that size pushes up through the crust, it doesn't rise through empty rock. In Siberia, it happened to be rising through vast beds of coal and salt deposits and other buried carbon-rich rock. Heating that kind of material doesn't just melt it, it cooks it, the way you'd cook anything over an open flame. And cooking rock releases gas, colossal volumes of it. Carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur compounds push skyward in quantities that dwarf anything a human industrial economy has managed, even today, times over. This is one of the reasons scientists study this event so closely now. It is, in the geologic record, the closest thing we have to a natural experiment in what happens when a huge slug of extra carbon gets dumped into the sky in a short span of time. You already know, in a general way, that carbon dioxide traps heat. You've heard that sentence 1,000 times, maybe so many times it doesn't land anymore. So let me put it to you a different way. Run that experiment at Siberian trap scale, and the ocean itself starts to cook. There's a set of measurements published in 2012 by a team led by a researcher named Yadong Sun, using the chemistry preserved in ancient conodont fossils, tiny tooth-like remains from an extinct group of eel-like creatures whose chemical composition shifts with the temperature of the water they lived in, like a thermometer that got buried 250 million years ago and is only now being read. What Sun's team found: tropical sea surface temperatures reaching roughly 40 degrees Celsius, that's above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, at the ocean's surface in the tropics. Stop and actually picture that. Not a hot bath, hotter than a hot bath. Hot enough that if you filled a swimming pool to that temperature and got in, you would be in genuine danger within minutes. Now imagine that is the ambient condition of an entire ocean surface, not for an afternoon, but as the new normal, for a stretch of time long enough to matter evolutionarily. Marine life doesn't have the option of stepping out of the pool. For animals adapted to a cooler world, this isn't discomfort. It's a ceiling closing in on where you're allowed to exist at all. Now, I promised you I'd be honest about what's solid and what's contested, and this is one of those moments. The temperature measurements themselves are solid data. They've held up. But the tighter claim that got attached to them early on, that this extreme heat was specifically why the oceans stayed near dead for so long afterward, acting almost like a lid holding recovery down. That causal link was challenged. A response published the following year in the same journal pushed back on how directly the two things could be tied together. So take the number as real, the 40 degrees, but take the explanation for exactly what it did to the recovery as an open question, not a closed one. That's how science actually works. The measurement survives, the story built on top of it sometimes doesn't, at least not without more evidence. But heat alone, even ocean cooking heat, isn't the only thing pushing on life during this window. There's a second effect, one that reaches into the ocean's chemistry itself, and it's worth walking through slowly, because it explains something you might not expect. Why the sea, of all places, became one of the worst places on Earth to be alive. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water. You've felt a version of this yourself if you've ever noticed a glass of soda go flat faster in the sun than in the fridge. Heat drives gas out of liquid. Do that to an entire ocean, and the amount of oxygen dissolved in the water starts to fall, especially once you get below the sunlit surface layer in the water column where most marine animals actually spend their lives. At the same time, all that extra carbon dioxide isn't just warming the air. Some of it dissolves directly into the sea, and when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it makes the water more acidic, the same basic chemistry that makes carbonated water taste sharp on your tongue. Push that far enough, and it becomes very difficult for anything that builds a shell or a skeleton out of calcium carbonate to keep building one. Reef-building corals, shelled creatures. The literal architecture of Permian sea life starts to become chemically inconvenient to exist. So now picture the layers stacking on top of each other, because that's the real horror of it. It's not one mechanism, it's several, arriving together. Water too hot, water starved of oxygen, water turning faintly corrosive. And for the creatures living through it, there was nowhere to swim to escape all three at once, because it wasn't a local event. It was global. There's one more mechanism worth naming because it's become one of the most famous explanations for this extinction in popular science writing, and also one of the most contested among the actual geochemists who study it. A paleontologist named Peter Ward proposed that, on top of everything else, parts of the ocean during this period became eukaryotic, a term for water so starved of oxygen that certain bacteria take over, bacteria that breathe in a way utterly alien to us and exhale hydrogen sulfide as waste. Hydrogen sulfide is the gas behind the smell of rotten eggs, and in high enough concentrations, it's lethal to most animal life, and even damaging to the ozone layer if it reaches the upper atmosphere in quantity. It's a genuinely chilling idea. Oceans that don't just suffocate life, but actively poison the air above them. I want to be straight with you about this one, because it's the kind of idea that's almost too good, too cinematic, not to want to believe. The geochemical evidence for euxenia during this extinction is real in places, but it isn't global consensus. The picture that's emerged from more recent work is patchier and more regional than Ward's original framing suggested. Bad in some ocean basins, less clear in others, not a single uniform toxic ocean girdling the planet. So hold on to the image, because it captures something true about how strange and hostile these seas became. But don't mistake it for a fact nailed down the way the zircon dates are nailed down. Some of the story's darkest color is still being argued over by the people who'd know. What isn't contested is the result. Trilobites, the armored survivors of nearly 300 million years of ocean history, the group that had outlasted ice ages and outlasted enormous stretches of upheaval. End. Not decline. End. Entire reef ecosystems that had structured shallow seas for tens of millions of years collapse, and in some regions simply don't reappear in any recognizable form for an extraordinarily long time. Whole branches of the tree of life, branches that had been growing since before there were trees to compare them to, get pruned down to nothing in that 60,000-year window. Here's a question worth sitting with before we go further. Why does this matter to you, specifically right now, reading this on whatever screen you're on? Because here's the thing nobody tells you about mass extinctions. They're not really stories about death. They're stories about selection, about which branches happen to survive a bottleneck and which don't. And every single branch of the tree of life you can see around you today, every bird, every mammal, every reptile, you, is a descendant of something that happened to make it through this one. Not because it was destined to, because of a roll of the dice that, if it had landed even slightly differently, would have produced a world with no mammals, no birds, and certainly no version of you standing here 252 million years later wondering about it. Now, here's the part of the story that took me by surprise, and I think it's the part that deserves the most attention because it's less famous than the killing itself, and in some ways more disturbing. You'd expect that after the dust settled, after the eruptions slowed, after the worst of the heat and the poison passed, life would bounce back. That's the pattern with most disasters in the fossil record. A crisis hits, diversity crashes, and then, on a timescale of a few million years, ecosystems rebuild. New species radiate into the empty niches left behind. Life, as it's often put, finds a way, and normally, in the fossil record, it finds that way fairly promptly, not this time. The recovery after this extinction was slow in a way that genuinely puzzled paleontologists for years, and honestly, still does to some degree. The scientific literature isn't perfectly settled on exactly how long recovery took, and I want to be honest with you about why, rather than hand you a single tidy number and pretend the debate doesn't exist. Part of the disagreement comes down to what you mean by recovered. If you're asking when ecosystems stopped actively perturbing and got back to some baseline stability, researchers like Chen and Benton, in work published in 2012, put that closer to 5 or 6 million years. If you're asking when the full complexity came back, the rich, tangled, multi-layered ecosystems with predators and prey stacked in intricate food webs the way you'd expect from a healthy biosphere, their estimate stretches to 8 or 9 million years. Other lines of evidence in the wider literature push the outer edge further still, and a round figure you'll sometimes see cited as a defensible upper bound is 10 million years. Not a single hard consensus number everyone agrees on down to the year, but a real, well-supported range. And even at the low end of that range, we are talking about a span of time that dwarfs the whole of recorded human history several times over. Try to hold that in your head at actual scale, because millions of years is a phrase that slides right past most people without leaving a mark. 10 million years ago, none of the animals you'd recognize on a nature documentary existed in their current form. 5 million years ago, the ancestors of modern humans were only just beginning to separate from the ancestors of chimpanzees and wouldn't look anything like a person for millions of years after that. Now imagine a broken world, reefless seas, impoverished forests, simplified food webs, persisting for a stretch of time on that same order. Not a bad decade, not a bad century, a bad several million years as the default condition of the entire planet. What does a world like that even look like day to day for the creatures living in it? Paleontologists who study the rock layers directly above the extinction boundary describe something almost eerie, a strange simplicity. Fewer kinds of organisms, smaller body sizes in many surviving lineages, a pattern sometimes called the Lilliput effect, where animals in the aftermath of the crisis are dwarfed compared to their pre-extinction relatives, as if the world itself had shrunk its ambitions along with its inhabitants. Disaster-adapted opportunists, hardy, unfussy organisms that can tolerate degraded conditions, dominating in a way they hadn't before and wouldn't again once things stabilized. It's the ecological equivalent of a burned forest that keeps growing back the same scrubby weeds for years, decade after decade, because the soil is too damaged yet to support anything larger. Why would it take so long? This is where I think the story gets genuinely strange, because the honest answer is, it isn't fully settled, and that unresolved quality is, to me, one of the most fascinating things about this whole event. It isn't as simple as, the volcanoes stopped, so recovery should have started immediately. The Siberian traps eruptions themselves wound down well within that first million years or so. But the consequences they set in motion, the chemical disruption to the oceans, the possible persistence of low oxygen conditions in parts of the sea, the loss of entire ecological roles that some organisms had played for hundreds of millions of years, those consequences appear to have outlasted the eruptions by a wide margin. It's less like a single blow and more like an illness that keeps a patient bedridden long after the initial injury is healed, because the injury damaged something structural, something the body needs time it doesn't have to rebuild. There's a particular idea in this area of paleontology worth sitting with for a moment. The notion that an ecosystem isn't just a list of which species happen to be present. It's a network of relationships, who eats whom, who depends on whom, who needs a very particular partner species to exist at all. Wipe out enough of a network at once, and you don't just lose individual pieces, you lose entire kinds of relationships, entire structural roles, and rebuilding those relationships from scratch. Evolving new species into new positions in a new web may simply take longer than most people intuitively expect, longer than a hurricane, longer than a wildfire, longer than any disaster whose timescale you have any personal reference for at all. I want you to notice what's happening in your own reaction to that idea, because I noticed it in mine the first time I sat with it. There's a comfort most of us carry, half-consciously, that nature heals, that damage to the living world is inherently temporary, that time alone repairs it. This event is one of the clearest pieces of evidence in the entire fossil record that this comfort is not a law of nature. Sometimes damage is structural. Sometimes the healing takes so long that temporary stops meaning anything reassuring at all. And that's not even the strangest part of what the fossil record shows about this recovery. Because it wasn't just slow. In some ways, it was almost unrecognizable compared to what came before. There's a phenomenon in the fossil record from this window that geologists call the coal gap. And when I first read about it, it stopped me cold. Because it isn't about the ocean at all. It's about the land and about something as basic as trees. For hundreds of millions of years before this extinction, and for hundreds of millions of years after, Coal is a normal thing to find in the rock record because coal is just compressed forest, dead plant matter piling up in swamps faster than it can decay, eventually pressed into the black seams miners have dug out of the ground for centuries. Coal formation depends on one simple thing: substantial forests, growing and dying, generation after generation, in wet, low-lying ground. For a stretch of time after this extinction, that stops. Across a significant portion of the geologic record from this period, workable coal deposits become vanishingly rare in a way that has no real parallel anywhere else in the last several hundred million years of Earth's history. Forests, in any substantial sense, seem to have simply failed to re-establish themselves at the scale needed to leave that signature behind. Not fewer trees. A landscape where the entire process of forest formation appears to have broken down for long enough that its absence carved a genuine, unmistakable gap into the rock itself. Think about what that means for a moment, away from the ocean entirely. This isn't just about fish and reefs and shelled creatures suffering in poisoned, overheated water. This is a planet where, on land, the machinery of a forest, the whole slow choreography of seed, sapling, canopy, deadfall, and soil, seems to have stumbled and gone quiet across huge stretches of the globe for a span of time long enough to leave an absence bigger than almost anything else recorded in the entire fossil history of plant life. Whatever broke, it broke everywhere at once, in the water and on the land, from the base of every food web all the way up. And yet, this is where the story does something I didn't expect the first time I read it, and it's worth walking through carefully, because it complicates the neat picture of a world in uniform ruin for 10 million years straight. Not every lineage recovered at the same crawling pace. Some groups came roaring back astonishingly fast on a timescale that looks almost like a rebound rather than a slow limp. Ammonoids, coiled, shelled relatives of squid and octopus, a group that had already survived earlier crises in Earth's history, show signs of diversifying again within as little as 1 million years or so after the worst of the extinction, spinning off new forms at a pace that looks, by the standards of this event, almost frantic. It's as if certain lineages found a shortcut back to complexity that the rest of the biosphere simply didn't have access to. That unevenness is, in its own way, the most unsettling detail of all, because it means recovery wasn't a single dial slowly turning back up from zero to normal in lockstep everywhere. It was patchy. Some parts of the world's living systems found their footing within a few 100,000 years. Others, full coral reef ecosystems, complex multi-tiered food webs on the seafloor, mature forests on land, stayed broken for a span of time, stretching toward that outer estimate of 10 million years. Imagine a house fire where the kitchen is rebuilt within a year, but the structural beams holding up the rest of the building stay compromised for a decade. The house isn't recovering. It's technically standing in a form nobody would call whole. Why should you, sitting wherever you're sitting right now, care about the difference between a fast-recovering ammonoid and a slow-recovering reef? Because it's a preview, written in stone, of something true about resilience in general, a truth that applies just as much to a forest, an economy, a body, or a mind as it does to a 250-billion-year-old ocean. Recovery isn't one thing. It isn't a light switch. Different parts of a damaged system heal on wildly different clocks, and the parts that depend on complex layered relationships, not just raw numbers of survivors, but the intricate web of who needs whom, are almost always the slowest, because you can't just refill them. You have to rebuild the relationships themselves from nothing, one tentative link at a time. And that observation is where this stops being a story only about 252-million-year-old rock and starts being a pattern you can trace almost anywhere you look, at almost any scale you choose. Because here's the strange thing I couldn't stop noticing once I saw it in the Permian: this exact shape. Rapid collapse followed by a recovery that is disproportionately, almost unreasonably slower than the collapse that caused it, isn't unique to mass extinctions. It's closer to a signature, one that shows up again and again wherever a complex interdependent system gets pushed hard enough to break. Think about a fire moving through an old-growth forest. The burning itself, the actual destruction, can happen in days, sometimes hours, an inferno racing through canopy that took centuries to grow. But the mature forest, the one with its full understory, its fungal networks threading root to root underground, its specific balance of shade-tolerant plants and the animals that depend on them, that doesn't come back in days. In some ecosystems, it doesn't fully come back in a human lifetime. The burning is fast. The relationships take generations. Think about a body recovering from a severe injury to something structural. Not a bruise, but a break in the deep architecture holding everything else up. The trauma itself is often a single moment, a car door, a fall, an accident that takes less than a second. The rebuilding of bone, of the nerve pathways, of the strength and trust the rest of the body needs before it moves the same way again, that stretches into months, sometimes years, sometimes never fully returning to what it was. Destruction is fast. It only takes a moment to break a structure that took years to build. Repair of that same structure has no comparable shortcut. It has to happen one cell, one connection, one small rebuilt relationship at a time. You could trace the same shape all the way up to something as vast as a civilization losing a body of knowledge, or all the way down to something as small as a single cell losing the delicate architecture inside it that lets it function. Destruction can be a single catastrophic event. Rebuilding a complex interdependent system is never a single event. It is always, at every scale anyone has ever measured it, a slow accumulation of small dependent steps, which is exactly why the 60,000-year kill and the 10-million-year quiet aren't really two separate facts about the end Permian extinction. They're the same underlying law of complex systems showing up twice at two wildly different speeds in the same event. I find that both comforting and disquieting in almost equal measure, and I think you might too once you sit with it. Comforting because it tells you recovery is not a myth. Ammonoids came back, forests eventually came back, coral reefs eventually came back, and so, ultimately, did the entire dazzling diversity of life you can see out any window today. All of it descended from whatever managed to limp through that 60,000-year bottleneck. Disquieting because it tells you, with unusual clarity, that whatever gets broken quickly does not necessarily come back quickly, and that anyone who tells you a damaged complex system will simply heal itself on the same timescale it broke is telling you something the deep rock record does not support. Now, turn that lens on yourself for a moment, because this is the part of the story I think about far more often than I probably should. You are, right now, a complex system built from relationships nested inside relationships, trillions of cells, each one a small chemical civilization, cooperating in a network so intricate that no one has ever fully mapped it. You didn't get built quickly, and you don't run on a simple switch that's either healthy or broken. You are, in the most literal sense available to biology, a recovery in progress that is never technically finished, cells dying and being replaced, tissue breaking down and rebuilding, a body that is less a fixed object and more a very slow, very patient act of ongoing repair that started before you were born and won't stop until you die. And here's the reframe I can't shake, the one that turns this from ancient history into something that sits differently in your chest. Every single ancestor you have, going back through every generation, every branch of the tree of life that eventually narrows down to you specifically, passed through that 60,000-year bottleneck 252 million years ago. Not metaphorically, literally. Whatever tiny, hardy, unglamorous lineage of Permian survivors happened to make it through the heat, the acid, the shrinking oxygen, some almost accidental combination of traits that let a handful of creatures keep breathing while the overwhelming majority around them did not, that lineage is a direct, unbroken thread leading to you. You are not a bystander to this story. You are its outcome. Every mammal that has ever lived, every one of your direct ancestors reaching back before mammals even existed as a group, threaded itself through that specific narrow gap in time. Take a breath right now, an actual one, and notice the air moving into your chest. That air is roughly a fifth oxygen, a concentration your body is finely, precisely tuned to require. Too little, and you black out within minutes. Too much, and it becomes toxic in its own way. During the worst of the event we've been walking through, that concentration in the atmosphere and in the surface ocean shifted in ways that made simply breathing, for countless species, no longer survivable in the way it had been. You are breathing air shaped, in part, by a planet that spent hundreds of millions of years recovering its equilibrium after very nearly losing it completely. The unremarkable act of inhaling that you've done without thinking about it your entire life is only unremarkable because 252 million years ago, a thin margin of surviving organisms kept an unimaginably difficult chemical negotiation with this planet's atmosphere from collapsing entirely. There's something almost vertiginous about sitting with the actual scale of the gap in time this leaves you standing across. 10 million years at the outer edge of that recovery window isn't just a long time in the loose way we use that phrase for a slow afternoon or a difficult year. It's long enough that if you tried to walk backward through it one human lifetime at a time, lifetime after lifetime laid end to end, you would need something on the order of 100,000 lifetimes stacked back to back just to cross it once. 100,000. Try to hold even a fraction of that number as something real, not just a figure on a screen, and you start to get a sense of how thin and temporary any single human concern actually is, set against a timescale where entire ecosystems can spend that long simply trying to remember how to be whole again. And yet, and this is the part that keeps this from tipping into pure dread, the part that earns the wonder as much as the unease, you're here. Not despite that 10 million year wound in the world's history, but in a strange sense because of it. The bottleneck that nearly erased everything also cleared the board. It emptied ecological space that had been locked up by trilobites and ancient reef builders and sail-backed reptiles for hundreds of millions of years, space that, over the following tens of millions of years, got filled by new experiments in living, including, eventually, the small, quick-breeding, warm-blooded lineages that would, after almost inconceivable further stretches of time and chance, become you. The worst thing that ever happened to life on this planet is also, in the coldest and most literal sense, one of the reasons there was room for you to exist at all. I don't think that fact resolves into something simple. I don't think it's supposed to. It sits in your chest the way this whole story has sat in mine since I first read it. Equal parts awe at how narrow the thread was, and unease at how narrow it still is, at how a planet's chemistry can tip from ordinary to nearly unlivable in a span of time that is, geologically, no time at all. 60,000 years to break a world that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build. 10 million more, by some honest estimates, just to begin remembering how to be whole again. And you, reading this, breathing that finely tuned air without a second thought, are what was left standing on the other side of that math. There's a reason this event doesn't have the same cultural footprint as the one that killed the dinosaurs, and I think that's worth pausing on, because it says something about which stories humans naturally gravitate toward. The extinction that ended the dinosaurs has a single dramatic image behind it, a rock from space, a crater you can point to on a map, a bad afternoon 66 million years ago that any child can understand and retell. It's a story with a villain you can visualize. This one doesn't have that. There's no single object to blame, no crater to stand at the edge of and say, here. Just a slow, grinding, planet-wide chemical unraveling, driven by a continent quietly flooding itself with lava for the better part of 1 million years. It's a harder story to tell in 30 seconds, and maybe that's exactly why it's less famous, even though, by nearly every measure scientists use, it did more damage to life on Earth than the asteroid ever did. The dinosaurs' extinction ended one particular dynasty. This one came close to ending the whole show. I think there's something worth sitting with in that asymmetry. We remember the fast, singular, visualizable disaster. We forget the slow, systemic, diffuse one, even when the slow one was worse. That's not just a quirk of paleontology trivia. It's a pattern in how people, generally, weigh danger. A single dramatic blow, gets remembered and mythologized. A gradual shift in the background chemistry of an entire system, heat creeping up, gases building, oxygen thinning, is much harder for any of us to feel in our gut as an emergency, even when the total damage done dwarfs the dramatic version. It's part of why geologists who study the Siberian traps in detail tend to choose their words carefully when they're asked, as they often are, whether this event has anything to teach us about carbon being released into the atmosphere and ocean today. The honest, careful answer isn't, "The Permian proves what's coming." The rates, the scales, the starting conditions are all different, and nobody serious claims a one-to-one prophecy sitting in 252-million-year-old rock. But the event remains one of the clearest natural records available of what happens over a long enough span when a large pulse of carbon moves through the atmosphere and ocean faster than the systems downstream. Coral, plankton, the chemistry of seawater itself can adjust to it. Not a prophecy. A case study written in stone by the planet's own hand of what too much, too fast has actually done, one time, for real, at a scale no laboratory could ever replicate. I don't think that fact is meant to be alarming in a cheap way, and I want to be careful not to overreach here. That's not what this story is for. But I don't think it's meant to be dismissed either. It's meant to be held the way the rest of this story should be held, as a genuine, sobering data point about how a living planet responds when its chemistry gets pushed hard and fast, sitting quietly in rock that took two geologists years of careful, unglamorous zircon counting to read accurately. Go back for a moment to that image of the cliff face at Myshyn, the layers of rock stacked like pages with the boundary running through the middle like a scar. Somewhere in the centimeters of stone spanning that line is the 60,000-year record of the worst thing that ever happened to life on this planet, compressed into a band of rock you could cover with your outstretched hand. Stand there, and on one side of your palm is a world of trilobites and ancient reefs that had persisted, essentially unbroken, for longer than anything alive today has existed. On the other side of your palm, quiet. A wasteland that would take, by some honest estimates, 10 million years to fully speak again. Everything alive on Earth right now, every bird outside your window, every animal you've ever loved, every person you've ever known, and you is what happened on the far side of that hand's width of rock. Not because anything was owed to us, because a thin, unglamorous thread of survivors happened to make it through, one that had no idea it was carrying the entire future of complex life on its back. Think for a moment about what it actually meant for Bowring and Burgess to do the work that pinned that 60,000-year window down. This wasn't a single triumphant afternoon in a lab. It was years of patient, unglamorous effort, hunting down the right ash layers in the right outcrops, extracting zircon crystals too small to see clearly without magnification, running measurement after measurement, cross-checking results against each other until the numbers held steady under scrutiny. There's no drama in that process the way there's drama in an eruption or a poisoned sea. And yet the result of that quiet, exacting labor is one of the most vivid facts in this entire story. Proof, at a level of precision nobody thought was possible for an event this ancient, that the true killing happened in a span of time almost too short to believe. I think about that kind of work more than I probably should, the idea that some of the most unsettling truths about deep time aren't uncovered in a single flash of insight, but assembled slowly, crystal, by people willing to spend years reading a language written in stone by nobody, for nobody, with no author who ever intended it to be read at all. The rock doesn't know it's a record. It just is one. And it took human patience, not human genius alone, to translate 60,000 years of ancient catastrophe out of a few centimeters of ash. That patience is, in its own quiet way, part of what makes this story trustworthy rather than just dramatic. Nothing in what you've heard tonight comes from a single dramatic claim taken on faith. The fast kill comes from radiometric dating, cross-checked and published. The ocean heat comes from chemical signatures locked in fossilized teeth, measured independently by multiple researchers. Even the parts I've flagged as contested, the precise link between that heat and the length of the dead zone, the extent of toxic, oxygen-starved seas, are contested in the healthiest sense of that word, actively argued over by people staring at the same rock, trying to get the story exactly right rather than merely dramatic. That tension between what's nailed down and what's still being fought over in journals isn't a flaw in the story. It's the story working the way honest science is supposed to work, and maybe that's the last thing worth sitting with before we're done. This event very nearly erased everything, and we only know the shape of that near erasure because a small number of people, generations later, were curious and careful enough to go looking for the scar and read it correctly. The planet almost lost its entire story. And then, hundreds of millions of years afterward, one of that story's own late arrivals learned to read the ending back out of the rock. There's still an honest gap at the center of this story, and I'd rather leave it open than paper over it, because that gap is part of what makes the whole thing feel alive rather than settled. Nobody has fully reconciled why some corners of this shattered world clawed their way back within 1,000,000 years, while others stayed hollowed out for nearly 10 times as long. There are good hypotheses, differences in how tightly a group's survival depended on a whole web of other species versus how self-sufficient it could be, differences in which regions of ocean and land got hit hardest by the heat and the chemistry. But a complete, agreed-upon account of exactly why the recovery clock ran so unevenly doesn't exist yet. It's not a failure of the science. It's the actual current edge of what's known, and it's worth naming honestly rather than pretending the story wraps up tidier than it does. Sit with that unresolved edge for a second, because I think it changes how the whole account should feel in your chest. This isn't a closed case file. It's a live one. Geologists are still out in the field right now, in outcrops on more than one continent, pulling more zircons out of more ash layers, trying to sharpen a number that's already startling and see if it gets even stranger under closer inspection. The story you've just heard is the best current reading of a 250,000,000-year-old crime scene, not a finished verdict. And maybe that's exactly the right note to end on, because it mirrors something true about the deep past in general. We tend to imagine deep time as fixed, finished, settled, dead stone, dead certainty. It isn't. It's still being read, one careful measurement at a time, by people willing to spend a career on a handful of centimeters of rock. The Permian world ended in a geological instant and stayed broken for longer than the whole of human history stacked end to end could fill. And somehow, out of that wreckage, slowly, unevenly, imperfectly, life found its way back to something rich enough to eventually grow a species curious enough to dig the story back up. Let's go back inside that zircon crystal for a moment, because the method deserves more than a glance, and slowing down on it earns you something you can't get any other way, a real feel for how confident these numbers actually are. A zircon crystal is almost absurdly small, often no bigger than a grain of sand, sometimes smaller. And yet inside that tiny grain, uranium atoms have been quietly, faithfully converting into lead for 250,000,000 years at a rate physicists have measured with extraordinary confidence in laboratories again and again. It isn't a rate that speeds up under pressure or slows down in the cold. It doesn't care what's happening on the surface of the planet above it, whether there's a flood, a war, an extinction, a sunrise. It just ticks, atom by atom, indifferent to everything except the passage of time itself. That's what makes it such a remarkable witness. It isn't telling you a story, it's simply refusing to lie. To get a usable answer out of a crystal that small, researchers don't measure one zircon and call it done. They gather dozens from a single ash layer, dissolve them under exacting laboratory conditions, and run the isotope ratios through mass spectrometers sensitive enough to detect proportions most of us have no everyday reference for. Differences finer than finding a single specific grain of sand somewhere across an entire beach. And then they do it again, in a different ash layer above the boundary. And they do it again in a third layer to make sure the story holds. Only once those independent readings agree with each other, layer after layer, do you get a number confident enough to publish. That's the unglamorous reality behind the tidy phrase you might read in an article. Scientists dated the extinction to 60,000 years. Behind that one clean sentence sits months of grinding, dissolving, and remeasuring tiny slivers of ancient ash, checking and rechecking a number too strange to trust the first time it appears. Now, hold that same tiny grain of a crystal next to the other extreme of scale in this story, the eruption that made the ash it came from in the first place. Try picturing the Siberian traps not as a single number on a map, but as a process happening in real time, the way it would have looked if you could somehow stand at a safe distance and watch centuries of it compressed into an afternoon. Fissures splitting open across a landscape larger than most countries. Rivers of molten rock advancing not in one place but in dozens simultaneously. Some flows thick enough that if you dropped a coin into the leading edge, it would still be sinking through solid rock hundreds of years later, long after everyone who witnessed that particular flow front had lived and died. Ash and gas punching high enough into the sky to circle the globe on prevailing winds, falling as a fine gray dust over regions that never saw a single drop of the lava itself. That's the process on the other end of the same crystal you just watched a scientist dissolve in a lab. Here's a detail worth sitting with, because it reframes what an extinction actually destroys, and it's easy to let the word extinction flatten into something abstract, a statistic instead of a loss. When a species disappears in a mass extinction, you're not just losing that species. You're losing however many million years of a specific evolutionary experiment. Every adaptation, every quirk of behavior, every particular solution to the problem of staying alive, that lineage had worked out through countless generations of trial and accident. A trilobite species that persisted through hundreds of millions of years of Earth's history had, by the time it vanished in this event, accumulated a genetic and behavioral inheritance more intricate than any single human institution has ever built in all of recorded history. And it can't be rebuilt. Evolution doesn't have a save file. Once a lineage's particular thread through the tree of life is cut, whatever knowledge, if you can even call it that, was encoded in its genes and its instincts is gone in a way that is, as far as anyone has ever demonstrated, absolutely permanent. Nothing else will ever be exactly that trilobite again, in any ocean, on any future Earth, no matter how many billions of years pass. That permanence is worth dwelling on, because it's easy to hear recovery took 10 million years and imagine something like a plant regrowing after a fire. The same species, the same forest, just delayed. That isn't what happened here. What grew back into the empty niches left behind wasn't a restoration of what had been lost. It was something new, built by different lineages, solving the same ecological problems in different ways, because the originals were gone and could never return. The ocean that eventually recovered complexity, 8 or 9 million years on by some estimates, wasn't the old Permian Ocean repaired. It was a new arrangement entirely, assembled out of whatever had happened to survive, in combinations that had never existed before, and, without this specific catastrophe, never would have. That's the part of deep time that's hardest to hold on to, because it cuts against the instinct to think of nature as something that returns to a fixed, correct baseline once a disturbance passes. There is no baseline waiting underneath, patiently, for the world to get back to. There is only whatever happens to survive a bottleneck, rearranging itself into whatever comes next. The Triassic world that eventually emerged from that 10 million year hollow wasn't a restored Permian world. It was a new experiment altogether, one that would, in its own turn, eventually produce dinosaurs and mammals, and much later, you. Take a breath. Feel it move into your chest, ordinary and automatic, the way it has every few seconds since before you had words for anything. That breath is the far end of a thread that runs all the way back to a cliff face in China, to a hand's width of gray rock separating a world teeming with trilobites from a world gone nearly silent. It runs back to a continent quietly flooding itself for the better part of 1 million years, to a sea heated past anything a living thing should have to endure, to a 60,000-year blink in which most of what was alive stopped being alive. And it runs back to the long, unglamorous 10 million year quiet that followed, the part of the story with no drama, No crater, no single moment to point to, just an empty world slowly, unevenly, remembering how to be whole. You are not separate from that story. You are what was standing on the far side of it, breathing air that a planet fought its way back into balance to give you, built from a lineage thin enough to have vanished 100 different ways, and didn't. The Permian world ended almost overnight and stayed broken longer than you can really picture. And somehow, out of that particular ruin, here you are, reading this, breathing this, the improbable, unhurried answer to a silence that once nearly became permanent.